Nedra mentioned faith, and today is a day to particularly talk about faith. And the tribe of Dan shows us by how they enhanced the message this Sunday with the flaming candles. Oftentimes on this day, we've had balloons floating in the air, and we've had cake and ice cream following worship, because this is a happy day. This is the birthday of the Christian church. This is Pentecost Sunday. This is the Sunday that we celebrate that Jesus came to the disciples and he blew the wind of the Spirit in them, and the flames were dancing off of the shoulders of the disciples and their friends. So it is the day that the church has traditionally celebrated as the birthday of the Christian church. And certainly it has to do with faith. But you know, I have preached to you many times about doubt, that it's just quite okay to doubt. And I've often said that that night before Jesus died and he was in the garden, he expressed grave doubts about whether his dad knew what he was doing. Because he said, "Hey, Dad, I don't want this to happen. Let this cup pass from me. If there's any way out of this deal, let's figure it out. Let's please do it. But thy will be done." So he expressed his own doubt, but he also expressed his own faith. And that's what we're about this morning. So I need to tell you, it's quite all right to doubt. Nowhere in the Scriptures can I find that God has condemned doubt. He knows that we're human, and he knows that as humans we're going to raise questions about our faith, and we are going to have doubts. Francis Bacon wrote many years ago, "If a man will begin in certainties, he shall end in doubts. But if he will be content to begin with doubts, he will end in certainties." You see, certainty is very difficult to achieve in this world. There will always be, I hope anyway, room for doubt. And I know that doubt can be disheartening. So some wise people have taken doubt to its logical conclusion. Now let me tell you what that is. The logical conclusion of doubt is to doubt your own doubts. Think about that. Robert Louis Stevenson, the author, was a person who doubted his own doubts. As a young man, he was full of doubts. And he questioned faith, and he questioned about everything that he had. But he finally came to assert there is a God who is manifest for those who care to look for him. And then in the later years of his life, Stevenson became a man of deep faith, profound faith. And toward the end of his life, he described his religious outlook as cast iron faith. Our scripture lesson this morning from John's Gospel is about the world's most famous doubter. You already know his name. The news of Jesus' resurrection had spread quickly among the disciples at Easter time. And you can imagine the quickened pulse and the rapid, excited speech of those who had encountered the risen Christ. And they shared their experience with others in great joy. And you can also imagine, I'm sure, the difficulty of those who heard the story but had a hard time believing the story. The most famous doubter, of course, was Thomas, but he was also called the twin. And Thomas said, unless I see the print of the nails in his hands and place my fingers in the print of his nails, unless I can put his hand in my hand in his side, I will not believe. Well, I suspect most all of us in our lives at one time or another have been able to kind of identify with Thomas. When we've had that doubt, I wonder if this is real, or questioning an article of our faith. And we probably, as humans, have rebelled. We too have doubted. But here's something I want you to know. Doubt is one of the most important tools that God uses to produce mighty men and mighty women. God uses doubt in order to make us stronger in our faith. I worry about somebody who comes to me and they can just spout out the Scripture in such a very holy way, and I don't know, they can say, I've never had a doubt in my life. And I think, wow, I wish I was that perfect. I'm not. I have had those doubts. I have wondered why. If you've ever said, why is this happening? That's doubt, my friend. And I want to say, have you ever had that experience? Do you have a brain? Do you ever use it? Do you ever doubt anything? I am convinced that God has deliberately placed many obstacles in our faith as we grow up from little children into adulthood. Those obstacles to faith in our world. If He meant for us to walk with utter certainty without ever questioning why does He not reveal Himself a little more clearly to us? Why does God not give us an understandable answer to such questions as, why do good people suffer? It would be so much easier to believe if He'd give us a clear answer to that question. Why didn't God give us a guidebook that is open? Why did He give us one that is so open to so many different interpretations? Why didn't He give us a guidebook that only has one interpretation for all? Why doesn't He just speak to us in a clear voice at the end of this sermon, perhaps, and reveal Himself so that we, kind of like those that saw Him early on, can leave worship and say, I have seen the Lord, and believe. Wouldn't that be nice? It seems clear to me that God intends for each of us at some time in our life to have just a little bit of a struggle with the great questions in life. It may be that such a struggle is really essential to a strong, mature faith. You see, I am much more impressed by somebody who comes to me with a question and has some doubt than I am someone who comes to me and seems just simply to be regurgitating nice-sounding spiritual phrases from the Bible. God uses obstacles to train us, to make us strong, and doubt is one of those tools that God uses. I want to use an analogy from the world of commercial fishing. Years ago, seafood companies had a perplexing problem with the shipment of codfish to consumers who live inland. Shippers discovered that frozen codfish loses its flavor in the shipping process. And shipping live codfish is no better, because in the holding tanks, the live codfish became soft and mushy. So somebody came up with the idea of throwing some catfish into the holding tank with the codfish. And catfish and codfish don't get along with one another. They're mortal enemies. And so, in a quest for survival, the codfish are kept in a constant motion as they seek to escape the catfish. Thereby, those cod are kept in peak condition, so when they get inland, they are flavorful when they get onto your dinner table. Now you know the story. Well, in a sense, doubt and frustration and other such obstacles that God has placed in our way, placed them in our tank, as you will, those obstacles are swimming around, causing us to move and to keep us fresh and flavorful. There is far more hope for the sincere doubter than for the person who says, of course I believe, I've always believed, never had a minute in my life I didn't believe or didn't question or ask why. One writer says, doubts are the ants in the pants of faith. They keep things moving. And there's a caveat to doubting, however, and that is at some point in our life, we need to begin to doubt our own doubts. Doubting our faith is easy. That's an easy thing to do. But doubting our own doubts is more difficult. You mean I might possibly have the wrong idea? You mean I might possibly be wrong? Heavens to Betsy, how can that happen? Doubting my own doubts is not an easy thing. Much of the doubt that we experience in young adulthood is probably a need to rebel against our upbringing, and to rebel against what we see as the status quo. And I suspect this may even be God's plan. If parents and children didn't disagree on something, your offspring would never leave home. They'd always agree with you and you'd stay at home. You see, spiritual maturity comes when we are ready to doubt our own doubts. This world is far too wonderful to have occurred just out of nothing and all by itself. And there is within us, each of us as a human, a hunger that I believe only a relationship with God can satisfy. And even the vast majority of the scientific community throughout the world believe in God and a higher power. Very few in the science world do not believe in a God and a divine power and a divine creation. They know there are some things in science that cannot be explained, and they can only be explained by a deep faith. It is very difficult for anybody, however, to doubt their own doubts. And Christian faith can only be analyzed from the inside. It's what's in here. It's not what is out there with someone else. It's what's in here. And here is where we have made a God of the scientific method. Those who have done that are going to have a problem. You can't find God with the most powerful telescope. You can't find God with the biggest test tube in the world. You can't find God with the most enormous computer and the best computer brain in the world. There is only one way to find God, and that is to take a step of faith and entrust your life to Him, to give your life over to God, and to enter into a daily walk with God. I can't prove to you or anybody else the existence of a God. You have to prove the existence of God to yourself. And I want to use a little analogy about that. Could I prove to you that love exists? A scientist could attach all kinds of electrodes all over your body, and he could try to measure love and pleasure by your pulse rate and by your respiration rate and blood pressure and all those kind of things. Maybe see if you sweat a little bit in the presence of the one that comes in that you love. That wouldn't prove love. You might just add a stout drink of caffeine, and it could move the needles all over the place, but that wouldn't prove love. The only way you and I can ever prove love is to have the experience of loving, of being loved. And so it is with faith, my friends. The only way you can have faith is to have experienced it. And there are only two ways that the existence of God can be proved that I know of. The first is by testimony of others. And we hear people testify to their faith, and that's good. We need that. We need that reinforcement of faith. But we can say with total certainty that there have been millions of persons who have experienced faith and experienced God in their daily lives. There are lots of us, millions of us. But if you're a skeptic, you can listen to us, and you're probably still going to be a skeptic. Our testimony may not mean much to you. So the most conclusive evidence of the existence of God is to experience God yourself. As the old song says, I can't sing anymore, I would. You ask me how He lives. He lives within my heart. It finally boils down to practicing faith. Faith that there is a God. And sometimes for some people, It's fake it until you make it. Sometimes you just say, I am going to believe in God. There's a story, true story, about a pre-civil rights African-American community in the state of Florida. And the story says that during the times of political elections, even though blacks were not allowed to vote, this community of this African-American place would go out and they would rent a voting machine. And they'd go through the process of voting. And they knew their votes weren't going to count, but they went ahead and voted anyway. And when they were asked by a member of the white community, why every year do you do this? You go rent this voting machine and you vote even though you know your votes don't count. Oh, just practicing. Just practicing. Maybe sometimes that's what we have to do to practice our faith. I'll tell you a little secret about your pastor. There was a time in my life when I went to church and I admitted it, just in case. Just in case there was something to this bit. It took that personal experience to develop a personal reality with God. You see, believing in what is not yet seen means that we practice or believe and behave as if it already exists. Just play like it if you're having trouble. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King said, faith is taking the first step, even when you don't see the whole staircase. That is what leaders and visionaries do. Take the first step, and then you may see the whole staircase. They believe in something bigger than they themselves are, and then they begin to act as if it's so. Amen.